Hi, my name is Sosa Wickstrom, and I'm a professional portrait artist as well as a library clerk at Albany Public Library, Hat Ranch. I'm just making this video because we're in quarantine right now, so I was going to do my portrait class, but I guess I can't do that. But instead, I still wanted to provide a tutorial of how I do one of my portraits, and I hope this will inspire some of you who are maybe stuck at home to break out the markers and do some portraits yourselves. So here we go. Oh, and in case you're wondering about the music, this is usually the music I play during my classes too. The artist is Blank Banshee, and it's a self-titled album. So the first step of the portrait is to get multiple photographs so you have a good idea of what the person's face looks like from a three-dimensional perspective. There are multiple different ways to do a portrait, not just one way, but I'm going to explain what my process is when I'm doing a portrait for a commission. Markers are my favorite medium to use because they are very easy to clean up afterwards and to keep track of. They're also easy to transport different places, so on the whole they're just a very convenient material. But actually my first step is to do a sketch, and for this I picked one primary photo that I'm working with. But I also made sure I had a really good idea of what these people looked like first. Because sometimes there are these little tricks of the light and things that make people look different than how they actually look if you're just looking at one photograph and you don't know what the people look like. So it's really important to get a good idea in your head before you start the portrait. By the way, I use alcohol-based markers, which is usually what people mean when they talk about art markers, and that's why the end result comes out looking a little bit more like watercolor. You can tell it's made with markers, but it definitely looks more professional than if I were to use just Crayola or some other brand that's meant for children. So the first step is to do the sketch to make sure that everything is really blocked in the way I want it to look. In this particular example, it turns out that I don't really change anything that I do in the beginning, but actually a lot of the time I will do a sketch and then decide that I want to change exactly where the figures are centered on the page, and I can really do a good amount of alteration in the sketch, which is why I do it in pencil first. I also don't use the eraser that comes with a pencil. I always use a larger eraser. You can use a kneaded eraser or a regular eraser, like a pink pearl eraser or something. That way you're less likely to damage the paper and you can erase larger areas at a time. The kneaded eraser is nice because it doesn't create shavings, but it doesn't work quite as well as the normal eraser, so if you have a part that you're trying to erase that you can't get with the kneaded eraser, that's when you're going to want to use the normal one. So after I do the sketch, I compare it to the photograph a few times, make sure I like where everything is, and everything's generally the way I want it to look. I usually don't go into too much detail on the sketch because that's going to be for later, and I'm going to erase it after I go over the pencil and pen, so it would really be a waste of time for me to go into too much detail at this stage. So the second step after I do the sketch is I go over it in felt tip pen. And the most common brand of felt tip pen is a Micron pen. I don't know what kind of pen I'm using in this one. It's not a Micron, but it's some cheap knockoff. Actually, I think when I bought it, it was being marketed as a signature pen. So that's a cool little loophole. It works really well and it doesn't smudge when you erase over it. And notice how I outlined all the prominent lines except for the wrinkles around the people's mouths when they're smiling, because even though those wrinkles do appear in real life, it often makes the subjects look old if you draw them that way. And in a commission, I try to make the subject look sort of typically flattering. So I try to reduce any blemishes I see. And those lines are still going to be there because they're smiling, but I'm going to draw them afterwards with a lighter color and sort of add in darker and darker as I go to make sure I don't accidentally get it too dark. So after I fill everything in with the pen, I erase the pencil. And I make sure that I erase it all the way because if you go over pencil with alcohol-based marker, you are not going to be able to get the pencil out from underneath. And what I'm doing here is actually putting on some white mask, which you normally see watercolor artists use, but I figured it would work just as well for a marker drawing. And it acts just like glue, but it comes off really easily. So what it does is it blocks the pieces of paper that you want to make sure stay white throughout the drawing, like the highlights. And it looks a little bit weird and yellow when it's on there, but at the very end you'll see I'm going to take it off, and those parts stay as white as they were at the very beginning. So after everything's erased, I start going in with the markers. I usually start with the face, or the most important part, because on the off chance I mess up, I can always start over. I really do want the faces to be perfect because they're the focus of the piece. And with the markers, I usually go from light to dark because I'm layering them. And with this particular example, I didn't actually realize I was going to run into this problem, but a lot of my markers started running out of ink while I was in the middle of it. And if that ever happens to you, but you still want to keep going, one of the things you can do, which is what I did, I just put some 50% isopropyl alcohol in a dropper and took the nib out of the marker and dropped a bunch of drops of alcohol onto the marker to get it wet again. And this time the marker was completely out of ink. Sometimes all you have to do is wet it and it'll start going again, but this time no such luck, so I actually had to improvise. So I found some watercolor and mixed that in with the isopropyl alcohol and then dripped that on the marker, and I got it going again that way. I didn't actually know you could do that, but it worked, so yay, learning experience. And filling everything in with the markers is just a really long process. So first I go in with the alcohol-based markers, which are more like watercolor. And then afterwards I'm going to use some oil-based and acrylic-based markers to correct any mistakes and sort of blend things and get the 3D effect I want. And the thing that makes alcohol-based markers a little bit more challenging than watercolors is that you can't really mix your own colors normally. You can technically use a blender, but in my opinion the blender creates just as many problems as it solves, so I actually prefer not to use it. But I do like to layer different colors and just use the markers themselves to blend. The lighter colors especially work for blending just as well as the blender does. The only time I ever use the blender is if I accidentally make an area too dark and I want to lighten it up, and that's when I go over it with a blender, because for some reason that kind of bleaches it out. So you might notice that I'm using some colors that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like purple and blue on the skin and things like that. And the reason for that is But we actually do have many different tones in our skin that a lot of people don't notice. But if you really pay attention, you will start to notice the more subtle details of color, especially ones you wouldn't expect, like purples and blues in the shadows. And personally, I think adding those colors makes the piece more vibrant as a whole, so I would suggest, like, even if you just have an intuition that a color might be there, you can't really tell if you necessarily see it or not, you should just add it because why not? It'll make it more interesting. The only thing I would be really careful with is avoid doing any weird experimentation with shading around the nose and mouth, because that can make it look like the person has like a beard or a 5 o'clock shadow, which is fine if they have that, then go ahead, but that's the area where I would advise to be most careful. And so in this part, I'm just coloring the entire portrait in one step at a time. This portrait really did take a really long time. It took over 4 hours to finish, but I'd say the most important piece of advice I have for this step is definitely make sure to take plenty of breaks and stay hydrated. And listen to whatever kind of music makes you feel comfortable. And really just make sure that you're having a good time. Because it's not just about the result, it's also about the process, and the process can be really fun. So And one thing I did in this portrait, which I would actually not recommend, is I thought it would be a good idea to use poster markers for some of the larger areas, like his shirt and her dress. And for her dress, you can't really tell the quality of the marker gets worse because it's black, but on his shirt, I think that it is kind of visible that it's not a very good quality marker. You can see a lot of streaks, so I would not recommend using poster markers. You should always have an extra sheet of scrap paper to test out what the marker is going to be, what the quality is, and whether it has enough ink before you use it on what's going to be your finished product. And you can't see it, but I was actually doing that for most of the skin tones. I don't know why I decided not to do it on his shirt, but let this be a cautionary tale. Luckily, it's just the shirt. It's not like I messed up on his face or anything, so it's not really that big of a deal. Important to take a step back at regular intervals and look at your piece as a whole to make sure everything looks the way you want it to. you're going to notice a lot more things when you step back. Another trick that I didn't use in this example, but that two tricks that are also very handy, is to either look at the piece in a mirror or look at it upside down, and sometimes you will notice mistakes that way too that you did before. So after I'm all done coloring things in with the alcohol-based markers, I'm going to keep switching back and forth, but mostly you'll see me just using the oil and acrylic-based markers because their ink is opaque. So on the spots that I got too dark anywhere, that is one way to sort of cheat and line them up afterward. And after you use the oils or acrylics, if you want to put in more layers of alcohol-based markers, you can, but you have to make sure that you let the paint dry first, or else you could ruin the marker. The reason I'm using oil-based and acrylic-based markers is just because I bought two different sets, and the oil ones happen to be a lot bigger than the acrylic ones, so I'm using acrylic ones for finer detail than the oils. Really the only difference between the two is that the oil markers soak a little bit more into the paper, when the acrylic paint will dry flat on top of the paper. So for the oils, if you're trying to get the color that the marker is, you may need to let it dry and go over it, and let it dry and go over it, etc. And the oils actually give you more possibility of layering. So you can't blend with either of the paint-based markers. But if you don't have the exact color you want, you can put layers of different colors over each other. And again, every time you put a layer, you have to wait for it to dry. Because if you don't, you could also end up damaging the paper too. I forgot to mention that. So as you can see, I did the portrait almost completely with alcohol-based markers, and at the very end I used the paint-based markers to correct any mistakes and add in some highlights into the eyes. Highlights in people's eyes are essentially just reflections of whatever's in front of them, and when you're doing a portrait, since nobody knows what's in front of them, you can just choose to put the highlights wherever you want. It's going to look fine. So I put a couple more highlights than were actually in the photograph.
Visualization. Let go of all outside concerns. Close your eyes. Now take a deep breath in. Allow an image to form. Drift more and more into this image. Let it become so real that you can look around and see the colors and shapes and all the things around you. Imagine that you're doing something you'd like to be doing in the place you'd like to be, feeling physically strong and emotionally balanced. Take a deep